year after his father's death, Max Rudd still had a box of assorted papers sat in his flat, taking up space. The box reeked slightly from years sat in a succession of invariably smoke-filled properties. The box contained the manuscripts for his father's unpublished novels and has become a symbol of his father's ultimate failure, not as a father but as a fighter. He waited most of his life to have the valuable time to pursue his writing career. Retirement offered him that chance, but instead he couldn't overcome his dependencies, which would allow him to capitalize on the chance. Now he was gone, and everything Ian Rudd had hoped for sat in one dirty box in his son's hallway.
I felt like I didn't have enough life experience to draw on to write anything about. It's been difficult for me to kind of even acknowledge myself as a writer. Part of doing that was, well, kind of thinking about things like, well, do I have a voice? What is it?
Still struggling with his own grief at never convincing his father, there was still so much in life to fight for. Gradually comes to realization that in this box could be the chance of a catharsis he needs.
It started because after my dad died, I had a lot of his things left, amongst which was a lot of his own writing, which was never published or was never at a stage where he was happy with it to be published. Going through all of those things, I found an unpublished manuscript by my grandfather, which I didn't even know my dad had. It kind of made me feel like all of this stuff is sitting there, not doing anything. Knowing how much of a passion that my dad had for these things, it just made me feel that they needed to go somewhere. It's 3 generations of writers, but we all write about very different things. My grandfather's use of language and how that varies from my dad's and from my own. It's been difficult to juggle trying to put in enough hours. A lot of this I'm doing from scratch. Just not knowing what's the best decision. I mean, the job I was doing before last year, so there's been moments where I was thinking about it, thinking, is this the wrong path to take? Am I sinking lots of money that I could be using to improve my skill set as an actor? It's a difficult thing for anyone to take on, especially when you're trying to work on it on your own. Probably the hardest thing from in terms of the business itself, especially recently, has been accepting help. A lot of the things that I've done is I very much find my own way and figure out how to do things myself. But recently it's come to a point where it's getting to the point where it's bigger than me. So surrendering part of that responsibility to somebody else, that's been really difficult. I think it was just the fact that he was doing it may have been what influenced me, and so it was that, and also the small kind of library of books that we had, that it was something that was vital to him that he wanted to do, but at the same time that it was always something that always seemed to be just beyond his reach. As you can see, this tree fell on the 10th of July 2014, which is coincidentally precisely 7 days before my dad passed away. When I first saw it, it was literally just a massive log. We came here a couple of months after this for my dad's wake after he was cremated up at Earlham Crematorium up the road. This isn't somewhere where my dad ever came, and the associations are somewhat arbitrary. As tenuous a link as it may seem, it did bring back a lot of memories. As far as I'm concerned, if they evoke or provoke the right emotional reactions, stir the right memories, then that's a valid link. But every time I am here, I look out the window and I see this, and it just reminds me of my dad's funeral. It's a positive sort of kick in the backside, if you like, to remind me not to give up on it.
After his father died, it became more clear then you need to start doing something about this now, because it was going to become a legacy for his family.
I was lucky enough to have a good circle of friends who are willing to get in and help.
So I think it's important to remember that throughout Max doing all this writing, is that he was, like me, holding down a full-time job at the same time. I think there was a lot of times when you see him come in bleary-eyed from the night before where he'd been up way too late. I seem to remember there were a lot of times when he'd just been burning the candle at both ends. He was piecing together a family puzzle.
It's very inspirational listening to Max talk about his writing, and then when you read the books you can definitely feel the love and the passion that's gone into that, and there's definitely more than blood travelling down the generations. There's something very beautiful there as well.
So this is a lot of the stuff that I've found from doing research at the British Library about my grandfather. This was really where it started for even looking at my granddad's things. As I said, this was my grandfather's, would have been my grandfather's 7th novel, The Golden Peony. It's been quite difficult to find out everything because he died in 1955 when my own father was only about 12 years old. The amount of information that came to me handed down directly through the family was very limited. I had an understanding that he was somebody reasonably well known within his community. They range from announcements for some of his books. So for example, this one here, The Evil Cross, which is my grandfather's 2nd book. But you've even got examples which I thought was quite nice. There's a couple here which were short stories which he wrote under his pseudonym, Sidney Asmond. Again, as far as I know, these stories don't appear anywhere else. To the front cover of the Fiery Free Press, which has my grandfather's obituary, which was surprising. He seems to have been very prominent in the Operatic Society. In fact, from one of these pieces here, there's a story that he wrote an opera, including all the orchestration for it as well. It was something he wrote in the 30s, which is quite fascinating. My cousin Tim sent me this, which is pretty much the only photo that I've ever seen of my grandfather. I'd never seen a picture of my granddad or my grandmother on my dad's side, so that was quite a revelation. And then seeing that, especially when you look at photos of my dad when he was older, you can really see the family resemblance. We always had a lot more connection and interaction with my mum's family. When I was growing up, I knew my dad had siblings, but they didn't visit that often. So kind of going back into this has been something of a journey. The other part of the reason for doing the business on the whole, it was to try and reconnect with the side of the family that were very remote during my upbringing. These are the copies of my grandfather's books, which I've managed to track down. Some of them, I think this one, I ended up having to order from Australia because it was the only place that I could find a copy of it. Most of them, as you can see, don't have dust jackets anymore, with the exception of The Evil Cross, My cousin, who does have copies of most of these as well, managed to do us a couple of scans of the original dust jackets from a couple of the books that I haven't got to yet. The Englishman stirred into a more comfortable position. The incessant rattling of the train was distracting, and he had much to think about. Conditions in Germany were deplorable. He had realised the intolerable state of affairs months ago. Food quality was poor and meagre. Intrigue stalked with sinister purpose. In the background of all the sacrifice lurked the shadow of concentration camps, prisons, and the executioner's block. The dawn each German had hailed with expectant hopes of an El Dorado had faded into the blackest of nights. They had merely exchanged the yoke of Kaiserism for the fetters of Nazism, which constituted the old civility in a new form. Every man was a slave to a vast military machine, every woman the chattel of a predominant state, and every child swallowed by the maw of a monstrous jingoism. You're not just reading another war story, you're reading stories that were written and released at the time, and which have been read by people who lived through the war.
There's swathes of books that were printed at that time that have fallen out of print and out of view from the world, and I think it's great that he's resurrecting them and giving them a second chance.
I don't think he ever really did stop writing. I mean, he felt he had something to say, no doubt inspired by his own dad's work. It was difficult, I think, for him to do that while he was supporting a family. There's quite a difference between a lot of the pieces that he wrote. I mean, Daffodil Cottage, which was the one book that's published, is quite definitely a children's novel, whereas some of the other pieces that he wrote are very much more adult in their themes. There's To My Two Sons, Pierre and Max, because it was from their breakfast time chatter when they were both young that the idea came to me. Albert Sparrow moved slowly and inquisitively closer to the rusting rim of the metal guttering that protruded from the weather-beaten thatched roof of Daffodil Cottage. He peered in silent amazement at the large white car parked in the narrow lane beside the cottage's open wooden gate. Earlier he had seen two men, dressed in snowy white coats, enter the old woman's nest with a strange bed which they carried between them. Much to Albert's surprise, they reappeared carrying the frail old lady in the bed, wrapped snugly in a warm red blanket, her head propped up by a clean white fluffy pillow. Her aged face showed signs of recent tears, and, on seeing Albert's little face peeping above the black guttering, she raised a wrinkled hand and waved a silent farewell to him. Gently the men lifted the bed into the open doors of the waiting vehicle. While one of them stayed with the old lady, the second firmly closed both doors before entering the front of the strange machine and driving slowly along the autumn-dressed line of trees growing in the garden. I don't know how much more beyond what he'd written that he would have wrote. Whether that was purely because it was the wrong time in his life to do it, whether he'd missed his window, if you like, to do it. The only thing that I think I would say that it has helped with is helped me defining my own style. When you're editing other people's works, it's a bit of an effort to remain as true to their style as you can. I suppose there's a degree of validation for what I do as a writer.
Stepping through the doorway, he started cautiously up the tile-flagged steps. The air here seemed musty and still as he proceeded upwards. Pausing halfway, Paul gazed out of the window on his right, at the opticians adjacent to the store, where he had once taken his glasses while he still needed them, to be fixed. Continuing on, he came to a rest on the top step, as another memory, more like a vision, flashed through his mind. He'd come up here once without the others. It had been the first, and consequently the only time he had done so alone. He had stood close to where he did now, and had been convinced that he had heard footsteps coming along the corridor around the corner from him. Of course, he'd known that that was impossible. Dope-infused paranoia, most likely, but it had unnerved him, and he slipped quietly back downstairs and rejoined the others outside, saying nothing of his phantom experience.
a lot of that grew out of desire and need to just want to escape. When I stopped doing hospitality work and started doing a lot more sort of office-based and quite static jobs from something so banal and mundane, there's a lot more to do and a lot further to go. Xadrum hasn't just curled up its toes and died in the first 18 months. I think that's that in itself is heartwarming.
If it wasn't for Max, I never would have known that any of these books existed. That would be a real shame, because it's not just about Max's personal history, it's about local history, it's about the people that are around us that we don't even know are doing these things. He's a fairly local man, and yet I never knew he existed until I got to know Max.
Having done this now and still working on it, as I say, it makes me feel a lot more connected to my own writing. I kind of understand where it comes from a bit more. And also, just as a way of finding out about my family.